Broadcast live to an audience of more than 12 million Americans, Jasmine Crockett confronted House Speaker Mike Johnson during a congressional hearing that quickly became tense and disorganized. Johnson responded by mocking her, brushing off her remarks as a performance for television, and then leaving with a confident smirk. What he didn't seem to anticipate was that Crockett had documented the entire exchange and was carrying a detailed 200-page file that could challenge his position. Within 48 hours, she filed a $100 million lawsuit that captured national attention. The courtroom soon turned into a high-profile legal clash. His public image declined, while her composed silence became one of the most talked-about moments in the country. Many began asking what exactly was on that recording that led to such serious consequences. The marble floors of the Capitol reflected the overhead lights, yet the atmosphere was far from calm. Every seat on the House Budget Committee was filled. The press section, usually only partially occupied during routine hearings, was alive with reporters, cameras, and producers quietly giving instructions through headsets. There was a noticeable sense of anticipation in the room. At exactly 10:04 a.m., the red recording light turned on, and the hearing went live. The banner read, House Budget Review, Medicaid, SNAP, and Federal Welfare Programs. For millions watching at home, especially those facing financial challenges, the topic felt deeply personal, connected to daily survival. Jasmine Crockett, dressed in a charcoal blazer and silver earrings that reflected the studio lights, sat upright behind a stack of carefully labeled folders. Each one covered a different issue: housing shortages, food insecurity, Medicaid reductions, and letters from constituents. She came prepared with documentation and testimony, ready not just to present concerns but to directly question policy decisions. Across from her sat Speaker Mike Johnson, the driving force behind what he described as one big beautiful bill. The name sounded reassuring, even appealing, until examined more closely. The proposal included cuts to subsidies, stricter food stamp eligibility, and changes to Medicaid expansion. Johnson leaned back with his fingers interlocked, appearing calm and confident, like someone waiting for the other side to make the first move. Crockett, however, was focused and deliberate. She leaned toward the microphone and spoke with steady control. This bill, she said, isn't just misguided, it's harmful. It targets people who are already struggling. The only appealing part of it is the font on the cover page. The room fell completely silent. There were no coughs or shuffling papers, only the faint clicking of cameras and a growing tension in the air. Johnson paused, lifted his water bottle, and took a slow sip, as if carefully managing the pace of the exchange. Without looking directly at Crockett, he spoke into the microphone with a detached tone. Congresswoman, he said, next time consider preparing with a calculator instead of a megaphone. Budget analysis isn't based on emotional anecdotes. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. The tone carried a sense of dismissal that seemed intentional. Crockett did not visibly react. She remained focused, though her fingertips pressed lightly against a handwritten letter from a single mother in Shreveport. Around the room, a quiet discomfort began to spread. Johnson hadn't simply disagreed. He had minimized the experiences being discussed. The silence broke when a voice from across the chamber spoke up. Representative Linda Martinez stood, composed but firm. Mr. Speaker, that comment was beneath the dignity of this institution, she began, but Johnson interrupted her sharply. I did not recognize the gentlewoman from California, he said, his tone suddenly formal and rigid. And I did not request commentary. The atmosphere shifted noticeably. The room felt colder, more divided. Crockett remained still, but something had clearly changed. The issue was no longer just about policy, it was about who had the authority to speak and who was expected to stay silent. The structured environment of the hearing began to feel strained, as if under pressure. Crockett did not respond emotionally. Her silence carried weight, suggesting preparation rather than hesitation. She reached for a crimson folder labeled Medicaid Impact, Louisiana, with calm precision. The cameras focused closely as she removed a single page and held it up. Her voice remained steady and clear. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, she began, if this bill passes, 190,000 people in your state, Mr. Johnson, will lose Medicaid coverage. The number represented more than data. It reflected real people and real circumstances. That includes children with asthma, individuals managing diabetes, veterans, working parents, and elderly residents, she continued. These are not abstract ideas. These are your constituents, your neighbors. After a brief pause, she added, they will lose healthcare not because they failed the system, but because the system stopped supporting them. A different kind of silence followed, one shaped by the weight of the statement. The tension was evident across the room. Johnson remained in the same relaxed posture, appearing unshaken. He did not consult notes or acknowledge staff. Instead, he responded with a brief smirk and a remark that quickly drew widespread attention. "Louisiana doesn't need welfare dependency," he said. "We don't need people who believe the government owes them a living." The words, delivered casually, carried a strong impact. Reactions were immediate. Pence paused. A quiet response came from the press gallery. Still, Crockett remained composed. She showed no visible surprise. Her expression stayed focused and analytical. Then she stood, slowly and deliberately. She placed the paper down and faced the speaker directly. Her voice was calm but firm. "You're taking away people's support," she said, "and then criticizing them for struggling. You're limiting resources and calling them unmotivated. You're removing assistance and questioning their response." Each sentence was clear and direct. She wasn't seeking approval. She was outlining consequences. The room, once centered on policy discussion, now felt like a place of reflection on broader values. Crockett had shifted from argument to accountability. As the room absorbed her words, attention turned back to Johnson. Instead of adjusting his position, he leaned forward, pressed his microphone button, and made a remark that moved the exchange beyond policy. "She's not a serious person," he said. "She's performing for television, style over substance." The comment had no direct connection to the policy discussion. It focused instead on personal perception. The tone was dismissive, suggesting familiarity with speaking in such a manner. The reaction across the room was immediate but restrained. Reporters exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond in the moment. Several members of Congress appeared visibly tense. The impact of the remark was clear. For many, it reflected a broader pattern often experienced in public life, where arguments are set aside and individuals themselves become the focus. The room remained quiet, but the significance of the moment was widely understood. And still, Jasmine did not react outwardly. She didn't blink. Her posture remained composed, her hands resting on the same page she had referenced earlier. But her gaze shifted, focused, deliberate, and steady. The emotion in her eyes did not rise, it sharpened. It became clear. The visible tension faded, replaced by something steadier and more controlled than anger, resolve. Crockett was not embarrassed. She was engaged and alert. She looked at Johnson not simply as a colleague, but as someone who had just set in motion a major political conflict, perhaps without realizing it. She did not need to respond immediately. Some responses are not delivered in the moment. They take shape in what follows. The exchange could have ended in silence. It could have stopped at the point where officials often return to formal language to ease tension. But Mike Johnson, whether feeling confident, frustrated, or certain of his position, chose another direction. The tone shifted toward public criticism. The chamber remained tense. Jasmine Crockett had not responded, had not replied. That silence may have unsettled him more than a direct argument. Her calm seemed controlled, even deliberate. He leaned forward again, holding the microphone with intention, and raised his voice, now more pointed than before. "I don't have time for an emotional speech," he said, adding a comparison that drew immediate attention. The remark did not sound like policy discussion. It landed heavily. Audible reactions spread across the room. Staff looked up from their screens. Several lawmakers leaned back in disbelief, and one dropped a pen abruptly. Johnson had not just criticized a colleague. He referenced a well-known civil rights figure in a way that many in the room found inappropriate for the setting. It was not a routine disagreement. It was a public comment delivered openly, with cameras broadcasting it across the country. His voice carried through the chamber, and for a moment, the room felt smaller under the weight of the exchange. Crockett's expression remained neutral, though her breathing was measured and steady, as if she was choosing not to take on the tension around her. The room seemed to pause with her. No one moved, yet the atmosphere shifted. Respect gave way to visible frustration. The discussion moved beyond policy into broader principles. Outside the chamber, the clip spread quickly. Within minutes, news anchors began discussing it. Legal analysts and commentators compared it to past moments where public figures were labeled as overly emotional or dismissed in similar ways. Inside the room, however, Jasmine Crockett remained steady. She did not react immediately. She allowed a few seconds to pass, not out of hesitation but with purpose. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. Without rushing, she took out her phone. The movement was calm and deliberate. It was not for attention. It was for documentation. When statements are made publicly, records matter. She still did not respond verbally. But with her phone in hand, she made it clear that the moment would not simply pass without record. She did not speak after the remark. Not in the chamber, not to reporters, and not online, where reactions often spread quickly. But Jasmine Crockett understood something important. Not every conflict is addressed through volume. Some are addressed through clarity. While commentators debated and networks analyzed the exchange, she moved forward quietly and precisely. The next morning at 9:31 a.m., in a courthouse less than a mile from the Capitol, her legal team filed a civil lawsuit that quickly became one of the most discussed political developments in recent years. The suit named Speaker Mike Johnson directly. It did not rely on political framing or protection, only on written claims and legal standards. The filing presented a clear argument. It alleged defamation carried out with intent. It stated that Johnson had publicly made statements that could harm reputation, referencing identity and credibility in a way that raised legal concerns. The primary evidence was the live hearing viewed by millions of Americans, including his tone, wording, and the nature of the remarks. The lawsuit listed damages totaling $100 million, $25 million tied to reputational and professional impact, and $75 million in punitive damages intended to discourage similar conduct in the future. The message was direct. This was not only about a single exchange. It was about setting expectations for how public platforms are used and how individuals are addressed within them. By midday, Washington was fully engaged in the story. Major outlets described it as a significant legal case involving a sitting congressional leader. Analysts noted its potential to influence discussions around political speech and accountability. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, but Crockett did not appear. There were no public statements, no press conference. Only a line in the filing that stood out. No position places someone beyond accountability. As the lawsuit drew attention, Mike Johnson responded publicly. He entered the Capitol press room with a firm posture, appearing prepared to address the situation directly. Cameras flashed as journalists gathered, ready to hear whether he would acknowledge the concerns or defend his remarks. He approached the podium without notes and spoke in a steady tone. "I stated my position," he said. "We should not turn political disagreements into larger disputes." The room fell quiet, not because the statement resolved anything, but because it reframed the situation in a way that many found incomplete. It was not an apology and it was not a detailed defense. It presented the exchange as routine disagreement rather than a matter requiring deeper examination. While the statement aimed to move forward, public reaction had already begun to develop independently. Within hours, a widely shared video began circulating across major platforms. A media group compiled footage from multiple sources, including official recordings and independent angles. The final video provided a clear and uninterrupted view of the exchange. The footage showed Johnson's posture shifting as Crockett spoke, his expression changing as the conversation progressed. It captured the key moment and the tone in which the remarks were delivered. There was no added commentary. The visuals spoke for themselves. By evening, public response increased significantly. Organizations released statements addressing the broader implications of the exchange. Some described it as an example of how authority can be used in public settings. Others called for further review and discussion. Legal experts contributed opinion pieces examining the situation from different perspectives. Some noted the distinction between political disagreement and personal commentary. Even individuals from across the political spectrum acknowledged that the moment raised important questions about conduct and accountability. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She did not need to speak. Public reaction and documented footage were already shaping the narrative. Inside Capitol Hill, pressure continued to build. Reporters approached lawmakers in hallways, elevators, and offices, asking direct questions. Many responses were cautious. Some officials chose not to comment. Others offered brief statements suggesting the need for additional context. One remark from a senior representative drew attention for its tone, as it focused on the reaction rather than the original exchange. The comment highlighted the ongoing debate, not just about what was said but how it was interpreted. Across the aisle, Democratic members held a closed-door meeting that evening. Without cameras or press, they discussed next steps. When they emerged, they presented a unified position. They would file a formal ethics complaint, addressing both the remarks and the broader environment in which they occurred. The decision was made quickly, reflecting the urgency of the moment. Soon after, several lawmakers spoke publicly, emphasizing the importance of maintaining respectful discourse. One statement framed the issue as part of a larger conversation about how individuals are treated in public roles. There was no applause, only the steady sound of cameras capturing the moment. As calls for accountability continued, attention shifted toward the legal process. The focus moved from commentary to formal proceedings. On the morning of the trial, the steps of the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. were filled with media and observers. Barricades lined the area, and broadcast trucks were positioned along the street. Millions were already watching across networks and live streams. Mike Johnson arrived first, accompanied by his legal team. His posture was controlled, though the attention surrounding him was significant. He entered without addressing the crowd. Shortly after, Jasmine Crockett arrived through a separate entrance. She wore a black suit and carried a large binder containing documents, affidavits, and timelines. She did not speak to cameras, but her presence was noticeable. It conveyed a clear purpose, focused on the case itself. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was formal and tense. When the presiding judge entered, the room came to order. Her opening statement was brief but direct. This case would focus on conduct and its implications. The gallery remained quiet. Jury selection followed. 12 citizens were chosen, representing a range of backgrounds and experiences. Their role would be to evaluate the case based on evidence and testimony. Even before proceedings began, the significance of the moment was clear. The case had moved beyond a single exchange. It now stood as a broader examination of language, responsibility, and the standards expected in public office. The quiet that followed jury selection was not empty. It carried a sense of anticipation across the room. When Congresswoman Crockett's lead attorney stood, his movement was steady and controlled, reflecting the seriousness of the moment. There was no raised voice, no dramatics. Only a clear and precise request that drew everyone's attention. Your Honor, we request to submit into evidence a live recording from the day of the incident, captured by a concealed microphone sewn into Congresswoman Crockett's blazer. A subtle reaction moved through the gallery. Even the stenographer paused briefly. The judge gave a small nod. The prosecution activated a small audio device on their table, which immediately became the focus of the courtroom. The speakers produced a faint crackle. Then the recorded words were heard. The tone of the voice did not reflect policy discussion. It sounded firm and dismissive. The phrasing suggested more than disagreement. It suggested an attempt to diminish rather than engage. The room grew still. No one spoke. No papers moved. The words hung in the air, clear and difficult to ignore. What had once been private was now heard by the courtroom and the jurors responsible for evaluating the case. One juror, seated near the center, raised a hand to her face, visibly affected. At the bench, the judge's expression tightened slightly, her hand resting near the gavel, though she did not use it. The silence itself carried weight. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not react outwardly or look toward her legal team. Her gaze remained forward, steady and focused on Mike Johnson. He no longer appeared relaxed. His expression shifted, and the confidence seen earlier was no longer visible. As the courtroom absorbed the recording, Johnson's defense team stood, moving quickly to respond. Their approach was coordinated, aiming to reframe the situation. His lead attorney, an experienced litigator, stepped forward. Your Honor, he began, the recording lacks full context. It captures only a portion of a longer and more complex exchange. He turned toward the jury, continuing in a measured tone. It is not entirely clear who the statement was directed toward. It may reflect general frustration rather than a specific comment about the plaintiff. He then raised a familiar legal argument. He stated that Johnson's remarks occurred within a legislative environment and could fall under protections related to legislative activity. The suggestion was that certain statements made in official settings may be shielded from legal consequences. Crockett's legal team responded without delay. Her attorney opened a folder and spoke with calm clarity. We anticipated that argument, Your Honor. He activated a display. What followed was not a short excerpt, but a complete recording, clear, verified, and time-stamped, lasting over 13 minutes. Unlike the earlier segment, this version provided full context. The jury heard Johnson walking past Crockett's desk after the hearing had ended. There were no cameras or official microphones present, only his voice. The timing showed that the exchange occurred minutes after adjournment, outside formal proceedings. The distinction was clear. The setting was no longer legislative. It was informal, and the statements were made without procedural protection. Next, another piece of evidence was introduced. The attorney presented an internal email dated 1 week before the incident. It was sent by a senior communications aide and outlined a strategy related to Crockett's public image. The document included specific language about framing her presence in a certain way during public appearances. It suggested emphasizing tone and perception rather than policy. The wording indicated a planned communication approach focused on presentation. No one interrupted. The document spoke for itself. It suggested that the issue extended beyond a single moment and reflected a broader strategy. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again. It felt more focused, more restrained. After presenting the recording and the email, the judge signaled for cross-examination. Crockett's lead attorney stood once more, calm and deliberate. He stepped forward and addressed Johnson directly. "Mr. Johnson, did you ever refer to Congresswoman Crockett in internal discussions using language that described her as a media figure shaped by perception rather than policy?" Johnson hesitated briefly and glanced toward his legal team. "I don't recall the exact wording," he replied, his tone controlled but uncertain. The attorney continued, holding up a document. "Let me clarify. This memo, dated March 7th, includes a statement attributed to you describing her in those terms. Do you deny making that statement?" Johnson paused, then responded, "If I said it, it was not intended personally. It was an observation about media dynamics." The attorney moved forward slightly. "To be direct, did you or did you not suggest limiting her visibility on camera?" Johnson shifted in his seat. "That may be taken out of context," he said. "It referred to segment timing, not to her personally." The attorney repeated the key phrase calmly. "So you are not denying the statement. You are clarifying how it should be interpreted." A subtle reaction moved through the jury. Some leaned forward slightly, others exchanged brief glances. The attorney continued. "For the court's understanding, when you discussed limiting media exposure, was that based on her policy positions or her presence?" Johnson responded quickly, "That's not what I meant. Criticism of communication style does not amount to defamation." The response did not fully address the question. The distinction between policy and presentation remained central. Before the questioning continued, the judge spoke. Her tone was measured and firm. "This court is not here to evaluate emotion," she said. "We are here to evaluate consequences." The statement clarified the focus of the case. The issue was not how something was expressed but what impact it had. Johnson did not respond further. The authority he held in political settings did not apply in this environment. The courtroom followed a different standard, one based on evidence and accountability. What began as a single recording had developed into a detailed record. What started as a disputed exchange was now under formal review. The judge's words remained in the air as the court recessed for deliberation. For 3 days, attention remained fixed on the case. News coverage followed each development with a central question. Would the legal process address concerns that had not been resolved elsewhere? Outside the courthouse, reporters continued their coverage. Inside, the 12 jurors carried the responsibility of evaluating the case. They represented a range of backgrounds and were tasked with considering both the evidence and the intent behind it. In the gallery, the mood remained focused. Jasmine Crockett attended each day quietly, dressed in black, her posture steady. She spoke rarely and avoided public attention. Her presence was consistent, calm, direct, and patient. Her focus remained forward. It reflected a long familiarity with similar situations, though this time the process allowed for full examination. On the 3rd day, shortly before noon, the courtroom reconvened. The jury had reached a decision. The announcement moved through the room with quiet intensity. Johnson sat at the defense table, his expression reserved. Beside him, his wife remained still, her hands folded tightly. The jury entered, composed and serious. When the clerk stood to read the verdict, the room became completely silent. "In the matter of Crockett versus Johnson," she began, "we, the jury, find the defendant liable for defamation." The statement was delivered steadily. The room remained quiet as she continued, noting that the findings reflected intent and impact. There was no loud reaction. Only a collective pause as the outcome settled in. The verdict represented a legal conclusion based on the evidence presented. It clarified that the claims brought forward had met the required standard in court. The decision did not rely on emotion or perception, but on the facts and their effect. The moment marked the conclusion of the trial phase, leaving a clear record of the proceedings and their outcome.